The human psyche is a landscape of profound complexity, capable of immense love, creativity and connection, yet also prone to patterns of self-absorption that can distort perception and sever genuine bonds. Consider the familiar scenario: a colleague who consistently takes credit for team efforts, subtly undermining others' contributions while basking in the glow of perceived success. Perhaps it's a family member whose conversations always circle back to their own achievements or grievances, leaving you feeling unheard and emotionally drained, as if your own experiences are mere footnotes to their grand narrative. Or a public figure who seems utterly impervious to criticism, demanding adoration while exhibiting a profound lack of empathy. Their public persona a carefully constructed edifice designed to deflect any perceived flaw. These behaviors, often perplexing and painful to witness, leaving those around them feeling invalidated and bewildered, point to a pattern that modern psychology has meticulously studied, and ancient spiritual traditions have long contemplated: narcissism. This essay delves into the multifaceted phenomenon of narcissism, exploring it not merely as a personality trait or a clinical disorder, but as a profound psychological pattern rooted in a fragile sense of self and a spiritual condition characterized by a deep attachment to the false ego. This attachment, often unconscious, creates a rigid self-concept that demands constant external validation, trapping the individual in a cycle of seeking approval and fearing exposure. It is a relentless internal demand for affirmation that paradoxically pushes away the very genuine connection it secretly craves. We will navigate the intricate pathways of its psychological origins and manifestations, while simultaneously seeking the wisdom offered by diverse spiritual traditions that illuminate the human struggle with self-centeredness and the path toward genuine self-realization. By integrating these lenses, we aim to uncover a more holistic understanding of narcissism, moving beyond judgment to compassionate insight into both its destructive potential and its potential as a catalyst for deeper awakening, recognizing the underlying pain that often fuels such patterns. From a psychological perspective, narcissism exists on a spectrum, ranging from healthy self-esteem and occasional self-interest to the more rigid and impairing patterns of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. At its core, clinical narcissism is often understood as a compensatory mechanism, a grandiose facade meticulously built upon a foundation of deep-seated insecurity and vulnerability. This internal world, often hidden even from the individual themselves, is a constant battlefield where the threat of inadequacy looms large, driving an incessant need to prove worth. Pioneering psychoanalysts like Otto Kernberg and Heinz Kohut illuminated the developmental roots of narcissism, suggesting it arises from early relational failures where a child's fundamental need for mirroring, validation, and secure attachment is unmet. This might manifest as inconsistent praise, conditional love, or outright neglect, leaving the child to internalize a sense of unworthiness and uncertainty about their intrinsic value. This leads to the formation of a fragile self-structure that relies heavily on external validation and an inflated self-image to protect against overwhelming feelings of inadequacy and shame, creating an insatiable hunger for admiration and control. Contemporary research in cognitive psychology and neuroscience further unpacks the cognitive distortions, emotional dysregulation, and altered brain activation patterns associated with narcissistic traits, particularly in areas related to empathy and self-referential processing. These distortions can lead to black and white thinking, an inability to accurately perceive others' emotions, and a persistent, almost obsessive focus on how every situation reflects upon the self. We will explore how grandiosity, entitlement, exploitativeness, and a pervasive lack of empathy are not signs of true strength, but rather desperate attempts to maintain a precarious internal balance, a constant tightrope walk over the chasm of their own unacknowledged shame. Parallel to psychology's insights, spiritual traditions across millennia have grappled with the human tendency toward egocentricity, identifying it as a primary source of suffering and an impediment to spiritual growth. Buddhist teachings speak of the self-grasping mind and the illusion of a separate permanent self, anatta, highlighting how attachment to this false ego, atta, perpetuates craving and dissatisfaction, dukkha. This self-grasping mind clings to transient phenomena, possessions, achievements, reputation, creating a false sense of enduring identity that fuels desires and aversions, binding individuals to a cycle of suffering and impermanence. Christian contemplative traditions warn against the sin of pride, viewing it as the root of all other sins, a radical turning away from God and neighbour, and a barrier to humility and unconditional love, agape. Pride, in this context, is not merely vanity, but a profound spiritual illness that elevates the self above all else, blinding one to their interconnectedness and dependence on a higher power and community. Islamic Sufism identifies the nafs al-amara, the commanding self or lower ego, as the driving force of selfish desires, requiring purification tazkiyat al-nafs to achieve annihilation of the false self, fana, and union with the divine. This lower ego, characterized by impulsivity, arrogance, and self-interest, is seen as a veil, obscuring the true spiritual essence and preventing genuine submission. Hindu Vedanta speaks of Maya, the illusion that obscures the true self, Atman, and binds us to the superficial world of ego and material attachments. Maya creates a dreamlike reality where the individual mistakenly identifies with their temporary personality, roles and possessions, rather than their eternal unified consciousness. Existential philosophy, while secular, also critiques inauthenticity and bad faith, urging individuals to confront their freedom and responsibility, rather than constructing false identities to escape anxiety and the burden of choice. It challenges individuals to live truthfully, without the pretense of a fixed, externally validated self. These diverse perspectives converge on a shared understanding. The inflated ego, while seemingly powerful, is ultimately a prison of the spirit, isolating the individual from true connection and genuine peace. It is a gilded cage, offering an illusion of control while denying authentic freedom and spiritual liberation. This essay will integrate these psychological and spiritual insights to offer a comprehensive understanding of narcissism. By examining the intricate interplay between the inner world of psychological defense mechanisms and the broader spiritual struggle with ego, we gain a richer, more nuanced perspective that honors the full complexity of the human experience. We will begin by establishing the core psychological and spiritual frameworks, examining the clinical definitions, developmental theories, and neuroscientific findings, alongside the profound wisdom of various spiritual traditions regarding the nature of ego, suffering, and attachment. This dual lens allows us to see how deeply ingrained these patterns are, both in our individual psyches and in the collective human condition, and why they prove so resistant to change. Subsequent chapters will explore the modern manifestations of narcissism in our culture, supported by contemporary research and examples, demonstrating its pervasive influence in various societal spheres. We will then delve into illustrative examples, drawing from historical spiritual figures, clinical case studies, and modern composite experiences to bring these theoretical concepts to life, showing how narcissism has manifested across different eras and contexts. Finally, we will explore practical pathways toward healing and transformation, integrating evidence-based psychological interventions with contemplative practices from diverse spiritual lineages, offering guidance for both those who struggle with narcissistic patterns and those impacted by them. Our journey will reveal that while narcissism presents formidable challenges, it also points toward a universal human longing for authentic connection, true self-worth, and ultimate liberation from the confines of the false self. Profound invitation to grow beyond the echo chamber of self. We have established that narcissism presents as a multifaceted phenomenon, a complex interplay between a deeply rooted psychological pattern and a profound spiritual condition. Having laid the groundwork for this integrated understanding, we now turn our focus to the psychological landscape of narcissism, seeking to illuminate its intricate structures, developmental origins, and the defensive mechanisms that sustain its often impenetrable facade. Our aim is to move beyond mere observation to a more nuanced comprehension of the internal world of the narcissistic individual, recognizing the fragile ego at its core. The journey into the psychological dimensions of narcissism necessarily begins with its historical conceptualization within the field of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud, a pioneer in mapping the human psyche, introduced the concepts of primary narcissism, an early healthy stage of self-love essential for development, and secondary narcissism, where libido is withdrawn from external objects and directed back to the ego, often in response to injury or frustration. While Freud's initial formulations were foundational, it was later theorists who significantly expanded our understanding of pathological narcissism as a distinct personality organization. Pioneering psychoanalysts like Otto Kernberg and Heinz Kohut illuminated the complex internal dynamics at play. Kernberg, through his object relations theory, described pathological narcissism as characterized by a grandiose self that is a fusion of the real self, the ideal self, and ideal objects, all defensively protecting against an underlying, fragmented, and devalued self. He highlighted the use of primitive defense mechanisms such as splitting, projection, and projective identification, which serve to maintain the grandiose self while externalizing painful internal states. For Kernberg, the narcissist's world is one of stark idealization and devaluation, where others are seen as either all good or all bad, never as integrated wholes. This binary thinking is a desperate attempt to manage internal chaos and prevent the unbearable awareness of one's own perceived flaws. In contrast, Heinz Kohut, the architect of self-psychology, viewed narcissism not primarily as a defense against aggression, but as a developmental arrest. He posited that narcissistic individuals suffered from a lack of consistent empathic mirroring during crucial early developmental stages. This deficit prevented the formation of a cohesive, resilient self, leaving them with a fragile self-esteem and an insatiable need for external validation or narcissistic supply. For Kohut, the grandiose self and the idealized parental imago were not merely defenses, but rather normal, albeit developmentally arrested, self-structures seeking completion through empathic responses from others. He emphasized the profound shame and vulnerability that lie beneath the surface of narcissistic grandiosity, often triggered by even minor slights or criticisms, which he termed narcissistic injury. These foundational theories underscore a critical paradox. The outward display of invulnerability, superiority, and self-sufficiency in narcissistic individuals often masks a deeply fragile and insecure self. It is a fortress built upon sand, meticulously constructed to repel perceived threats to an unstable internal equilibrium. As we move beyond these seminal works, we recognize that narcissism exists not as a monolithic entity, but as a spectrum of presentations, each reflecting variations in the expression of this underlying fragility. We distinguish primarily between two archetypal manifestations, grandiose or overt narcissism and vulnerable or covert narcissism. The grandiose narcissist is often the more recognizable archetype. They exude an air of superiority, demand admiration, and typically possess an inflated sense of self-importance. Their entitlement is overt, their boasts are frequent, and their disregard for the feelings of others can be stark. They are the colleague who consistently takes credit for others' work, the family member whose conversations always circle back to their own achievements, or the public figure who seems impervious to criticism. This grandiosity serves as a robust, albeit rigid defense mechanism, projecting an image of unshakable confidence and power to both themselves and the world. Their self-esteem, while seemingly robust, is entirely contingent upon external praise and validation, requiring a constant stream of narcissistic supply to maintain its delicate balance. In contrast, the vulnerable narcissist presents a more subtle, often perplexing picture. Their grandiosity is hidden beneath layers of insecurity, hypersensitivity, and a pervasive sense of victimhood. They may appear modest, shy, or even self-effacing, yet harbour a deep-seated belief in their own unique specialness, and an intense need for admiration, often expressed through passive-aggressive behaviours or subtle manipulations. They are exquisitely sensitive to criticism, which they experience as a profound personal attack, leading to intense shame and withdrawal, or sometimes to simmering resentment and passive retaliation. You might encounter them as the friend who constantly seeks reassurance but dismisses genuine compliments, or the partner who subtly undermines your successes while lamenting their own perceived misfortunes. Despite their outward differences, both grandiose and vulnerable narcissists share the core features of an unstable self-esteem, a pervasive lack of empathy, and a profound reliance on external validation to regulate their internal state. Beyond these two primary presentations, we also acknowledge the concept of malignant narcissism, a particularly destructive variant that combines narcissistic traits with antisocial behaviours, paranoia, and a sadistic enjoyment in the suffering of others. While less common, malignant narcissism represents the extreme end of the spectrum, exhibiting a profound deficit in conscience and an unyielding drive for power and control. At the heart of all narcissistic presentations lies a constellation of core psychological mechanisms that define and perpetuate the condition. First and foremost is the fragile self-esteem mentioned earlier. This is the central paradox, a grandiose external presentation concealing an inner world of profound inadequacy and shame. The narcissist's self-worth is not internally generated, but is a reflection of external mirrors, constantly needing to be polished by admiration and affirmation. Without this external affirmation, the grandiose facade crumbles, revealing the underlying void. To manage this fragility, narcissistic individuals employ a range of sophisticated defense mechanisms. Projection is a common strategy where unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or impulses are attributed to others. The narcissist who is secretly insecure might accuse others of being jealous. The one who struggles with responsibility might blame everyone else for their failures. Splitting. A more primitive defense involves perceiving oneself and others in all or nothing terms, either entirely good or entirely bad. This prevents the integration of positive and negative qualities, leading to rapid shifts in relationships where an individual can be idealized one moment and utterly devalue the next. denial. Also plays a significant role allowing the narcissist to ignore inconvenient truths about their behavior, its impact on others, or their own internal deficits. These defenses create a psychological fortress, protecting the fragile ego from the painful realities it cannot tolerate. Another defining characteristic is a pervasive lack of empathy. While narcissists may possess cognitive empathy, the ability to understand another person's perspective intellectually, they typically lack affective empathy, the capacity to genuinely feel and share another's emotions. This deficit means they can rationally grasp what you are feeling but remain emotionally detached from it, rendering them largely impervious to the pain they might inflict. For you, this often translates into feeling unheard, invalidated, and emotionally drained, as your experiences are consistently filtered through the lens of their own needs and perspectives. This lack of empathy fuels an overarching sense of entitlement, a deeply ingrained belief that they are special and deserving of preferential treatment, regardless of their actions or the impact on others. Boundaries are seen as obstacles to be overcome, and rules as applicable only to others. This sense of entitlement often manifests in a disregard for social norms, a demand for immediate gratification, and a profound frustration when their expectations are not met. The insatiable hunger for external validation, often termed narcissistic supply, becomes the lifeblood of the narcissistic individual. This supply can come in various forms: adoration, attention, fear, even negative reactions. Any response that confirms their existence and importance, however fleeting, serves to prop up their precarious self-image. This creates a relentless pursuit of external gratification, often leaving a trail of exhausted relationships and emotional wreckage. Finally, cognitive distortions are fundamental to the narcissistic worldview. These are biased ways of thinking that reinforce their grandiose self-image and protect them from self-criticism. They may magnify their own achievements while minimizing those of others, engage in self-serving biases that attribute successes to themselves and failures to external factors, or selectively recall information that supports their preferred narrative. These distortions create a self-reinforcing echo chamber, where their own perception of reality remains largely unchallenged. The origins of these psychological patterns are complex and multifactorial, often rooted in early childhood experiences. While not every individual exposed to similar circumstances develops narcissistic patterns, common themes emerge. These include early relational failures, such as inconsistent or insufficient parental mirroring, emotional neglect, or even excessive idolization without realistic feedback. In such environments, the child may learn that their true self, with its vulnerabilities and imperfections, is unacceptable, leading to the development of a false self, a facade designed to elicit the approval and attention that was otherwise lacking. This false self, while initially protective, ultimately becomes a prison, severing the individual from their authentic self and genuine connection with others. The impact of these psychological mechanisms on relationships is profound and often devastating. Narcissistic individuals frequently engage in a cycle of idealization, devaluation, and eventual discard, treating others as mere extensions of themselves, valued only for the supply they provide. Emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and a consistent invalidation of others' experiences become tools to maintain control and reinforce their own fragile sense of superiority. For those caught in the orbit of a narcissistic individual, the experience can be bewildering, emotionally depleting, and deeply damaging to one's own sense of self-worth. It is a constant tightrope walk over a chasm of emotional instability, where one's reality is constantly questioned and one's needs remain perpetually unmet. As we delve deeper into the psychological underpinnings of narcissism, we begin to see not merely a collection of unpleasant behaviors, but a deeply entrenched pattern of self-protection born from early wounds. This understanding, while rooted in psychological theory, inevitably leads us to a broader perspective, prompting us to consider the spiritual dimensions of this human condition. For if the ego is a psychological construct, its inflated form, as seen in narcissism, also speaks to a spiritual disconnect, a separation from the true self and from the interconnectedness of all beings. It is to this spiritual dimension that we shall turn our attention next, seeking to bridge the insights of psychology with the wisdom of ancient traditions. Having navigated the intricate psychological landscape of narcissism, tracing its developmental origins and examining its manifest behaviors, we now pivot our inquiry to a deeper, perhaps more ancient dimension, the spiritual. If psychology offers us a map of the ego's architecture, spirituality invites us to transcend the edifice entirely, revealing the very foundations upon which the false self is constructed and the profound liberation available beyond its confines. Here, we delve into how diverse wisdom traditions perceive the ego, not merely as a psychological construct, but as a spiritual impediment, a veil obscuring our true nature and severing our intrinsic connection to the divine, to others, and to the authentic self. Across millennia and myriad cultures, a recurring theme emerges. Suffering arises not from external circumstances alone, but from our internal identification with a limited, separate self, an ego. This ego, in spiritual terms, mirrors the false self we explored psychologically, acting as a self-created prison, an echo chamber of our own making that distorts reality and perpetuates an insatiable hunger for validation. In the profound teachings of Buddhism, the concept of anatta, or no self, stands as a cornerstone. We are taught that the idea of a permanent, unchanging self is an illusion, maya, a construct of clinging and craving that fuels suffering. Dukkha, the ego, with its relentless pursuit of affirmation, its desperate grasp for control, and its self-referential narratives, is seen as the primary source of our existential angst. It is this clinging to a perceived self, rather than embracing the fluid, interdependent nature of existence that binds us. For the individual caught in narcissistic patterns, this spiritual perspective illuminates the ceaseless striving for a solid, admirable identity where none inherently exists, leading to an endless cycle of dissatisfaction and the inability to experience genuine peace or equanimity. The spiritual path, therefore, becomes one of disidentification, of seeing through the illusion of the separate self to realize our interconnectedness and inherent emptiness, a liberation from the very need for external supply that defines the narcissistic struggle. Christianity, while emphasizing the individual soul, simultaneously warns against the perils of pride, often considered the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. Pride in this context is not merely vanity, but a profound turning away from God, a self-idolatry where the ego places itself at the center of the universe, usurping the place of the divine. This spiritual arrogance manifests as a refusal to acknowledge human finitude, a rejection of grace, and an inability to offer genuine love or humility. The false self, from a Christian perspective, is a persona built on worldly achievements, status, and self-aggrandizement, which separates the individual from the unconditional love and compassionate embrace of the divine. It is the spiritual equivalent of the psychological grandiose self, convinced of its own sufficiency and impervious to the need for repentance or genuine connection. The journey towards spiritual maturity involves dying to the ego, surrendering the will to a higher power, and embracing humility and service, a direct antidote to the self-centeredness of narcissism. Further east, for Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam speaks of the nafs, the lower self or ego, as a veil, hijab, between the individual and the divine. The nafs is characterized by desires, passions, and self-serving impulses that prevent spiritual ascent. The Sufi path is a rigorous process of purifying the nafs, transforming its base desires into spiritual virtues. This purification involves introspection, self-discipline, and a profound submission to divine will, gradually peeling away the layers of egoic attachment until the true self, united with the beloved, is revealed. The narcissistic individual, trapped in the demands of their nafs, remains perpetually veiled, unable to perceive the deeper realities of love and unity, forever seeking gratification in the superficial and fleeting. Similarly, in Vedanta and other Hindu traditions, the problem is framed as avidya, or ignorance, the mistaken identification of the eternal Atman, the true divine self, with the temporary illusory jiva, the ego-bound individual self. We are caught in the illusion of Maya, believing the material world and our egoic identity to be ultimate reality. This identification with the transient body, mind, and ego creates suffering, as these are inherently impermanent and cannot provide lasting fulfillment. The narcissistic individual in this view is deeply entrenched in avidya, mistaking the projected image of their false self for their true being, endlessly striving to bolster an illusion. The spiritual goal is moksha, liberation from this cycle of ignorance and suffering achieved by realizing the oneness of Atman and Brahman, transcending the ego's limitations. Even within existentialist philosophy, though not explicitly spiritual, we find parallel insights into the pitfalls of the inauthentic self. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of bad faith, the act of deceiving oneself about one's true freedom and responsibility, often by adopting a fixed identity or role to avoid the anxiety of choice. This resonates powerfully with the narcissistic individual's reliance on a meticulously constructed false self to navigate the world, avoiding the profound discomfort of their inherent vulnerability and the terrifying freedom of genuine self-creation. The existentialist call to authenticity, to confront one's radical freedom and responsibility, echoes the spiritual imperative to shed the ego's masks and embrace one's true, unadorned being. It becomes clear then that the echo chamber of self extends beyond the psychological realm into the spiritual. The ego, in its spiritual manifestation, constructs an impenetrable fortress, a gilded cage where the individual is trapped in a monologue of self-affirmation, unable to hear the whispers of the divine, the cries of others, or the authentic stirrings of their own soul. This spiritual isolation is perhaps the most profound tragedy of narcissism, creating a chasm between the individual and the universal currents of love, compassion, and interconnectedness. The constant need for external validation, for admiration, for a reflection of one's inflated self-image, becomes a spiritual black hole, consuming all light and preventing genuine spiritual growth. Moreover, we must acknowledge a subtle yet insidious phenomenon: spiritual narcissism. This occurs when spiritual practices, insights, or communities become yet another arena for egoic reinforcement. Individuals may co-opt spiritual language, concepts, or even perceived spiritual experiences to bolster their sense of superiority, to bypass genuine emotional work, or to assert a privileged connection to truth. We observe this in the guru who demands unquestioning devotion, the spiritual seeker who judges others for their perceived lack of enlightenment, or the individual who uses spiritual concepts to rationalize their self-serving behaviors. This form of narcissism is particularly dangerous because it cloaks egoic impulses in the guise of virtue, making genuine self-reflection and transformation exceedingly difficult. The false self here wears a spiritual mask, using elevated concepts to maintain its illusion of specialness and invulnerability, further entrenching the individual in their spiritual echo chamber. The spiritual cost of identifying with the false self is immense. It manifests not only as a lack of genuine peace and an inability to experience unconditional love, but as a deep-seated, often unconscious loneliness. Despite outward success, adoration, or even spiritual accolades, the individual remains fundamentally disconnected, longing for a wholeness that their egocentric quest can never provide. The spiritual journey, in essence, is a call to dismantle this false self, to shed the layers of illusion, and to break free from the echo chamber that prevents true spiritual awakening. It is a journey of profound humility, radical self-honesty, and a courageous embrace of our inherent vulnerability and interconnectedness. Thus, both psychology and spirituality, through their distinct lenses, converge on a shared understanding. The ultimate path to healing and liberation lies in transcending the limitations of the ego. While psychology offers tools to understand and integrate the fragmented self, spirituality provides the wisdom to dissolve the illusion of separation altogether, guiding us toward a realization of our true, expansive nature. This integration, which we will explore in subsequent chapters, holds the key to moving beyond judgment to compassionate insight, and ultimately to fostering pathways toward genuine transformation for all those touched by the intricate dance of narcissism. Having journeyed through the intricate psychological theories and profound spiritual insights defining narcissism in its various guises, we now stand at the precipice of understanding its lived reality. If the preceding chapters serve to chart the internal landscape of this condition, the fragile self, the compensatory grandiosity, the spiritual ego, then this chapter endeavors to illuminate the consequences of residing within such a construct, both for the individual ensnared and for those whose lives inevitably intersect with this powerful, often destructive force. We move from diagnosis to the experiential, exploring how the echo chamber of self, once erected, reverberates through every facet of existence, creating patterns of entrapment and impact that are as predictable as they are painful. The narcissistic individual, whether overtly grandiose or covertly vulnerable, inhabits a world constructed around a core wound. Psychologically, we recognize this as the desperate, albeit unconscious, effort to protect a deeply fragile sense of self from annihilation. Spiritually, it manifests as the soul's imprisonment within the elaborate architecture of the false ego, severed from the wellspring of genuine connection and authentic being. This internal state, this gilded cage. Is a paradox, outwardly gleaming with an often impressive facade of competence, charm or superiority, yet inwardly hollowed by a gnawing emptiness and a relentless terror of exposure. You might observe a colleague who seems to effortlessly command attention, whose self-assured pronouncements brook no dissent, or a family member whose life narrative is a relentless stream of triumphs and accolades. Yet beneath this polished exterior lies a relentless, exhausting performance. Every interaction becomes an audition, every conversation an opportunity to reinforce the desired image, every perceived slight a threat to the carefully constructed self. The energy required to maintain this edifice is immense. It is a tightrope walk over the chasm of perceived inadequacy, a perpetual vigilance against anything that might shatter the illusion. The true self, if it could be accessed, is often buried so deep beneath layers of defense and compensatory behaviors that it becomes almost unrecognizable, even to the individual themselves. This isn't merely a psychological burden, it is a spiritual one. The constant focus on external validation, on the acquisition of admiration or power, diverts the individual from the inner work necessary for spiritual growth. The ego, in its insatiable hunger for narcissistic supply, becomes a black hole, consuming all available energy and attention, leaving no room for the quiet introspection or selfless connection that spiritual traditions advocate. We see here the convergence of Kohut's concept of a developmental arrest, where the self perpetually seeks mirroring functions from the environment, and the spiritual understanding of the ego as an impediment to higher consciousness, both pointing to an unfulfilled need that external sources can never truly satisfy. This internal dynamic inevitably spills over into the realm of relationships, transforming them into extensions of the narcissist's own need for validation and control. The echo chamber is not just internal, it is projected outward, compelling others to reflect back the desired image, often at great personal cost. We spoke in Chapter 2 of the cycle of idealization, devaluation, and discard. From an integrated perspective, this pattern reveals itself as a grim dance choreographed by the false self. Initially, the narcissist idealizes you, seeing in you a perfect reflection, a source of potent supply that enhances their own self-image. You might feel uniquely seen, understood, or cherished, drawn into their seemingly magnetic orbit. This isn't genuine connection, however, but a projection. You are not loved for who you are, but for what you represent to their fragile ego. As the relationship deepens, or as your independent self begins to emerge, challenging their narrative or failing to meet their impossibly high, often unspoken demands, the devaluation begins. Your flaws, once overlooked or even charming, become magnified. Your opinions, once sought, are now dismissed or ridiculed. This psychological mechanism of splitting, where others are either all good or all bad, is fueled by the spiritual ego's inability to integrate complexity or tolerate perceived imperfection. The moment you cease to be a perfect mirror, you become a threat, an embodiment of the very inadequacy the narcissist fears within themselves. The shift can be disorienting, leaving you bewildered and questioning your own perceptions. This is where gaslighting often enters, an insidious form of psychological manipulation where your reality is systematically undermined, making you doubt your memory, sanity, or experiences. That never happened. You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. These phrases are not just manipulative tactics, they are defensive maneuvers of an ego desperately trying to maintain its fragile narrative, to avoid accountability, and to prevent any perceived challenge to its supreme authority. The ultimate consequence of this devaluation is often discard. When you are no longer serving the purpose of narcissistic supply, or when you're deemed too problematic, too independent, or too critical, the narcissist can cut ties with a chilling lack of remorse or empathy. Psychologically, this is a defense mechanism to protect the fragile self from further injury or confrontation. Spiritually, it underscores the profound isolation of the false ego, which views others not as unique souls with inherent worth, but as instruments for its own gratification. The lack of effective empathy, as discussed in Chapter 2, means the narcissist genuinely struggles to understand or share your emotional experience. Your pain, your confusion, and your sense of betrayal, these are often met with indifference or even irritation because they divert attention from the narcissist's own needs and narrative. For those impacted by such relationships, the toll is immense. You might find yourself perpetually walking on eggshells, constantly censoring your thoughts and feelings to avoid triggering a narcissistic rage or cold withdrawal. Your own sense of self can erode as your needs and perspectives are consistently invalidated. You may experience chronic emotional exhaustion, a pervasive sense of being unheard, and a profound bewilderment at the inconsistency and cruelty you encounter. This is the narcissistic wound, inflicted upon others, a deep scar on one's self-esteem, trust, and capacity for healthy attachment. It is a spiritual injury as well, as your spirit is systematically diminished, your light dimmed by the shadow of another's ego. Beyond individual relationships, the resonance of the echo chamber can extend to broader societal manifestations. We see narcissistic patterns replicated in leadership roles, where individuals prioritize personal power and adulation over the well-being of their constituents. The charismatic leader who demands unwavering loyalty, who demonizes dissent, and who projects all failures onto external enemies, embodies the grandiose self on a public stage. Their need for absolute control, for constant praise, and their imperviousness to criticism can lead to destructive decision-making and a profound disregard for the collective good. The cult of personality that often surrounds such figures is a societal amplification of the idealization phase, where followers are drawn into a shared fantasy that promises security and importance, provided they remain loyal reflectors of the leader's grandiosity. Furthermore, our modern culture, particularly through the pervasive influence of social media, often inadvertently fosters and rewards narcissistic tendencies. The emphasis on curated self-presentation, the pursuit of likes and followers as metrics of self-worth, and the constant digital mirroring can create an environment ripe for the development and reinforcement of a false, externally validated self. While not every user of social media is narcissistic, the platforms themselves can become fertile ground for the spiritual ego to flourish, encouraging a superficial engagement with the world where image often triumphs over substance, and where genuine connection can be supplanted by transactional interactions designed to boost one's digital persona. This societal reflection only intensifies the individual's entrapment within the echo chamber, making the path to authentic selfhood even more challenging. In understanding the impact of narcissism, we are not merely cataloguing behaviors. We are witnessing the profound suffering that arises when the self is fragmented, when connection is transactional, and when the spiritual journey is arrested by the demands of an insatiable ego. We recognize the tragic irony that the very mechanisms designed to protect the fragile self ultimately isolate it further, creating a prison of its own making. For the narcissistic individual, this is a life of perpetual performance, of relentless striving, and of an underlying unacknowledged despair. For those in their orbit, it is a journey often marked by confusion, emotional depletion, and a desperate longing for authentic connection that remains perpetually out of reach. Yet our aim is not merely to dissect this complex phenomenon, but to illuminate pathways toward understanding, healing, and liberation. Recognizing the intricate ways in which the echo chamber resonates, both internally and externally, is the crucial first step. It is an invitation to move beyond judgment to a deeper, more compassionate insight into the universal human longing for wholeness and connection that lies beneath the surface of even the most destructive manifestations of the ego. Having charted the depths of its impact and entrapment, we can now begin to explore the difficult but ultimately transformative journey of breaking free from its confines. The profound reverberations of narcissistic patterns, as we explored in the preceding chapter, extend far beyond the individual psyche, weaving their intricate threads through the fabric of interpersonal relationships and even shaping broader societal currents. We witnessed the gilded cage that encapsulates the narcissistic individual, a performance of grandiosity perpetually exhausting their internal resources, and the narcissistic wound inflicted upon those ensnared in their orbit, a wound that leaves scars of self-doubt, emotional exhaustion, and a deep sense of invalidation. The transactional nature of these relationships, moving through idealization, devaluation, and eventual discard, leaves a trail of broken trust and shattered self-worth. Yet, our inquiry would be incomplete, and indeed, deeply unsatisfying if we were to conclude our exploration without confronting the possibility, however arduous, of movement beyond this suffering. We are not merely observers of pathology, we are seekers of transformation, committed to illuminating pathways toward healing, both for those who embody narcissistic patterns and for those whose lives have been irrevocably altered by them. This chapter, therefore, marks a pivotal turn in our journey, as we begin to map the foundational principles for liberation from the echo chamber of self and the pervasive sense of unworthiness it projects onto others. Before we delve into these pathways, let us briefly acknowledge how the contemporary landscape, particularly the digital realm, has amplified and, in some ways, normalized certain narcissistic tendencies, making the need for this healing even more urgent. The relentless pursuit of likes, shares, and followers on social media platforms can easily become a modern form of narcissistic supply, offering immediate, albeit superficial, validation. The curated self, meticulously crafted for public consumption, mirrors the false self we have discussed, a projection designed to elicit admiration and envy, rather than reflecting authentic being. In this digital theatre, the lines between genuine connection and performance blur, often exacerbating the very isolation and spiritual emptiness that lie at the heart of narcissistic suffering. We see individuals, and even entire cultures, increasingly caught in a feedback loop where external validation becomes the primary metric of self-worth, making it ever more challenging to cultivate the deep internal wellspring of authenticity. It is against this backdrop of pervasive egocentricity and its attendant suffering that we turn our gaze toward healing. This is not a journey for the faint of heart, for it demands a courageous confrontation with uncomfortable truths, a willingness to dismantle cherished illusions, and an unwavering commitment to genuine self-discovery. We approach this task not with judgment, but with a profound sense of compassion, recognizing that beneath the armor of grandiosity or the veil of victimhood lies a universal human longing for connection, meaning, and wholeness. For the individual caught in the intricate web of narcissistic patterns, the path to healing begins with a seemingly impossible first step: acknowledgement and self-awareness. The very nature of narcissism, with its robust defense mechanisms of denial, projection, and rationalization, constructs formidable barriers against introspection. To admit to one's own patterns, to see the self not as flawless and superior but as deeply flawed and wounded, is to shatter the carefully constructed edifice of the false self. This initial breach in the wall of denial is often catalyzed by a profound crisis, a catastrophic relationship failure, a professional downfall, a sudden confrontation with existential emptiness, or perhaps an exhaustion so deep that the performance can no longer be sustained. It is in these moments of profound vulnerability that a sliver of curiosity, a flicker of genuine self-inquiry can emerge. Therapeutic modalities, particularly psychodynamic and schema-focused therapies, can be instrumental here, gently yet persistently, helping the individual to connect with their true emotional landscape, to trace the origins of their compensatory behaviors, and to begin to mourn the unmet needs of childhood that solidified the false self. This process of mourning is crucial, for it involves grieving not only the idealized self that never was, but also the authentic self that was neglected or suppressed. Once a degree of self-awareness takes root, the arduous work of developing empathy commences. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect, as the capacity for effective empathy, the ability to genuinely feel and understand the emotions of others, is precisely what is underdeveloped in narcissistic individuals. Healing here is not about a sudden epiphany, but a gradual, painstaking process of learning to recognize emotional cues, to tolerate the discomfort of another's pain, without immediately turning it back to the self, and to practice active listening without an agenda. Mindfulness practices can play a vital role, cultivating a non-judgmental awareness of one's own internal states, which then, paradoxically, creates space for a more open reception of others' experiences. Spiritual traditions, with their emphasis on compassion, karuna in Buddhism, agape in Christianity, ihsan in Islam, offer powerful frameworks for transcending self-absorption. Acts of service performed without expectation of praise or recognition can slowly reorient the individual's focus outward, fostering a nascent sense of interconnectedness that challenges the ego's isolating grip. Ultimately, the goal for the narcissistic individual is the rebuilding of a cohesive and authentic self, one whose self-esteem is rooted in internal worth rather than external validation. This involves confronting the deep-seated shame and insecurity that the grandiose facade was designed to protect. It means learning to tolerate imperfection, to embrace vulnerability, and to forge genuine connections based on mutual respect and reciprocity, rather than utility or admiration. It is a journey from the precarious tightrope walk of performance to the solid ground of authenticity, a liberation from the constant need to prove one's worth. Concurrently, for those who've been impacted by narcissistic patterns, the path to healing is equally demanding, requiring a different, yet equally profound act of courage. The initial step for the survivor is often validation and acknowledgement of harm. You, the individual who's experienced the invalidation, the gaslighting, the emotional abuse, must reclaim your reality. This means recognizing that your feelings are legitimate, that your perceptions were accurate, and that the pain you experienced was real, not imagined or exaggerated. This often requires external support, whether from a trusted therapist, a support group, or empathetic friends and family, who can mirror back your reality and affirm your experience, counteracting years of psychological erosion. Following this crucial validation, the imperative shifts to setting and maintaining firm boundaries. Narcissistic individuals inherently disregard boundaries, viewing others as extensions of themselves. To heal, you must learn to reclaim your personal space, your emotional autonomy, and your right to say no without guilt. This can be extraordinarily difficult, especially if the relationship is with a family member or a long-term partner, as it often involves confronting deeply ingrained patterns of codependency or fear of abandonment. Boundaries are not acts of aggression. They are acts of self-preservation, defining where you end and another begins, protecting your energy and your sense of self. A vital aspect of healing for the impacted individual is rebuilding self-worth, and processing trauma. Years of being devalued, criticized, or ignored can leave a profound sense of inadequacy. Therapy, particularly trauma-informed approaches like EMDR or somatic experiencing, can help to process the emotional wounds and rewire neural pathways that have been conditioned by abuse. This period is often marked by grief for the relationship that never was, for the person you hoped they would be, and for the parts of yourself that were lost or diminished in the process. It is a necessary grieving process that allows for detachment, not necessarily from the person, but from the illusion of what the relationship could have been. Spiritual practices can offer immense solace here, cultivating inner resilience, fostering a sense of inherent worth independent of external validation, and connecting you to a deeper source of strength and meaning. Practices like self-compassion, meditation, reflective journaling, and prayer can help to mend the fractured self, replacing self-blame with self-acceptance and fostering a profound sense of inner peace. Ultimately, the journey for both the narcissistic individual and those impacted is one of liberation. For the individual struggling with narcissistic patterns, it is liberation from the exhausting performance of the false self and the isolating prison of ego. For the survivor, it is liberation from the chains of invalidation and trauma, reclaiming one's authentic voice and inherent dignity. We contend that true and lasting transformation necessitates an integrated approach, one that weaves together the rigorous insights of psychological science with the profound wisdom of spiritual traditions. Psychology provides the maps to understand the intricate workings of the ego and its defenses, while spirituality offers the compass and the ultimate destination, a life lived in authenticity, compassion, and genuine connection. It is this integrated approach that promises not merely symptom reduction, but a profound reorientation of the self toward wholeness, a genuine awakening from the illusions of separation and suffering. We now stand at the threshold of exploring the specific modalities and practices that can facilitate this transformative journey, equipping us with the tools to navigate these complex inner landscapes with both wisdom and grace. As we embark upon this 6th chapter, we return to the profound realization that emerged from our previous explorations. The journey toward liberation from the confines of narcissism, both for the individual exhibiting these patterns and for those impacted by them, is not merely a psychological endeavor, nor solely a spiritual quest. Rather, it is an intricate and symbiotic dance, an integrated pathway where the insights of psychological understanding and the wisdom of spiritual traditions coalesce to forge a truly authentic and whole self. We have seen how the false self, a meticulously constructed defense mechanism, shields a fragile core, and how the ego, in its spiritual manifestation, binds us to an illusion of separation. Now, we turn our gaze toward the sustained practice of dismantling these structures and cultivating a life rooted in genuine connection, intrinsic worth, and expansive compassion. This integration is not a singular event but a continuous process of becoming, a dynamic interplay that requires both rigorous self-examination and profound self-transcendence. Psychologically, we learn to map the internal landscape, identifying the scars of early relational failures, the origins of cognitive distortions, and the learned patterns of emotional dysregulation. We confront the projections, the splitting, the denial that have long served as misguided protectors. Therapeutically, modalities such as psychodynamic therapy offer a deep dive into the historical roots of these patterns, while cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, equip us with practical tools to reframe thoughts, manage intense emotions, and develop healthier coping strategies. Attachment-based therapies help us understand how our earliest bonds shaped our capacity for intimacy and security, guiding us toward forming more secure attachments in the present. This psychological groundwork is essential. It provides the robust scaffolding upon which the edifice of an authentic self can be safely constructed. Without this foundational understanding and the tools to manage the often overwhelming emotional fallout of self-confrontation, spiritual insights can become mere intellectual exercises, or even, as we noted, another avenue for egoic inflation, a phenomenon known as spiritual bypassing. Concurrently, spiritual practices provide the broader context, the transcendent framework that imbues psychological work with deeper meaning and purpose. They offer an anchor beyond the fluctuating tides of the ego, fostering a connection to something larger than the individual self. Contemplative practices such as meditation, mindfulness, and prayer cultivate an inner stillness that allows us to observe our thoughts and emotions without immediate identification, creating a vital space between stimulus and response. This space is where true choice resides, where we can begin to dismantle reactive patterns and consciously choose responses aligned with our highest values. Ethical living, service to others, seva, and the cultivation of virtues like patience, humility, and unconditional love, as espoused in nearly every spiritual tradition, actively challenge the self-centered orientation of the narcissistic false self. They redirect our energy from accumulation and external validation to contribution and intrinsic fulfillment. Spiritual wisdom reminds us that our true nature is not defined by our achievements, possessions, or the admiration of others, but by our inherent interconnectedness and our capacity for love and compassion. This perspective provides the resilience and motivation to persevere through the often painful process of psychological self-discovery, offering a vision of liberation that extends beyond mere symptom reduction to profound spiritual awakening. The cultivation of the authentic self, therefore, becomes the central project of this integrated journey. We begin by consciously deconstructing the false self, that elaborate persona meticulously crafted in response to early wounding and a perceived need for external approval. This involves a fearless inventory of the roles we play, the masks we wear, and the narratives we tell ourselves and others to maintain a particular image. It is a process of stripping away layers of pretense, often uncomfortable and disorienting as the familiar structures of identity begin to crumble. Yet beneath the rubble of the false self lies the nascent truth of who we are, an intrinsic worth that requires no external validation to exist. The journey inward then becomes one of discerning this true self, a self rooted not in comparison or competition, but in an inherent sense of belonging and an unshakable inner knowing. This requires sustained introspection, a willingness to sit with discomfort, and the courage to listen to the quiet whispers of our deepest being, often obscured by the clamour of egoic demands. Mindfulness practices are invaluable here, teaching us to observe the arising and passing of thoughts and emotions without judgment, gradually detaching from the incessant chatter of the mind that often fuels the false self's anxieties and desires. We learn to let go of the attachment to outcomes, to the need for control, and to the endless pursuit of external markers of success or happiness, recognizing them as fleeting illusions. Embracing vulnerability and imperfection is a cornerstone of this authentic selfhood. The false self, by its very nature, is predicated on the illusion of flawlessness, demanding an exhausting vigilance to maintain its pristine facade. The true self, by contrast, understands that wholeness does not equate to perfection, It embraces our human imperfections, our failures, our moments of doubt and uncertainty as integral parts of the human experience. This radical acceptance of self fosters self-compassion, allowing us to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding we would offer a cherished friend. It is in this space of self-acceptance that we can dare to be truly seen, to drop the masks and allow others to connect with us in our full, complex humanity. This willingness to be vulnerable is not a weakness but a profound strength, for it is the gateway to genuine intimacy and reciprocal connection, moving us beyond the transactional dynamics that characterize relationships steeped in narcissistic patterns. Central to this integrated path is the transformative power of compassion and forgiveness, extending both inward toward the self and outward toward others. For the narcissistic individual on this arduous path, cultivating compassion begins with understanding the genesis of their own patterns. While never excusing harmful behaviors, a compassionate understanding acknowledges the deep-seated insecurity, the early wounds, and the developmental arrests that led to the construction of the false self. It is an understanding that the grandiose facade often conceals immense pain and fear. This empathetic insight, when coupled with a genuine desire for change, can pave the way for self-forgiveness, a release from the burden of past actions once they have been acknowledged, repented, and, where possible, atoned for. This self-compassion is not self-indulgence. It is the necessary nutrient for growth, allowing the individual to shed the heavy cloak of shame and step into a more authentic identity. For those impacted by narcissism, the journey of compassion and forgiveness is equally profound, though distinct in its application. It begins with radical self-compassion, validating the immense pain, the erosion of self-worth, and the emotional exhaustion they have endured. Their healing journey often involves processing trauma, reclaiming their narrative, and rebuilding their sense of self, independent of the narcissistic individual's distorted reflections. Forgiveness, in this context, is primarily a spiritual practice of liberation for the self, rather than a condoning of the perpetrator's actions or a mandate for reconciliation. It is the conscious decision to release the emotional chains of resentment, anger, and bitterness that can bind one to the past harm. This act of forgiveness, often arduous and iterative, frees the individual from the other's emotional hold, allowing them to reclaim their energy and direct it toward their own healing and flourishing. It is an act of profound self-love, a spiritual declaration that one's peace and well-being are paramount. As we move beyond the immediate work of healing, we glimpse the horizon of wholeness and purpose that this integrated approach promises. A life lived from the authentic self is not merely free from the suffering of narcissism, it is a life that flourishes. It is characterized by genuine contribution, a deep sense of connection, and an unwavering alignment with one's deepest values. Relationships transform from transactional exchanges to reciprocal bonds of mutual respect, empathy, and unconditional love. The capacity for joy expands, rooted not in fleeting external circumstances, but in an internal wellspring of peace and contentment. This flourishing extends beyond the individual, creating a ripple effect in their immediate relationships and, by extension, contributing to a more empathetic and less narcissistic collective consciousness. Imagine a society where leaders are driven by service rather than ego, where communities are built on genuine collaboration rather than competition, and where individuals are celebrated for their inherent worth rather than their external achievements. This is the aspirational vision that an integrated approach to healing narcissism holds. Ultimately, this profound journey of integration is a continuous process of becoming, a testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and our innate potential for deep, transformative change. It demands courage, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to truth, both psychological and spiritual. The path is often arduous, replete with moments of doubt and discomfort, but the promise it holds is unparalleled. Liberation from the confines of the false self, an awakening to the true self, and an ever-expanding capacity for genuine connection, profound purpose, and boundless compassion. We conclude not with an end point, but with an invitation to embrace this ongoing dance between the inner and the outer, the psychological and the spiritual, as the truest path to human flourishing. Having charted the integrated path towards deconstructing the false self and embracing the true, we now stand at the threshold of understanding that this journey is not a singular expedition with a definitive end, but rather a continuous unfolding. The cultivation of wholeness, we recognize, is an ongoing process of conscious engagement, a deliberate and sustained commitment to the principles of authenticity, empathy, and spiritual congruence. The liberation from the confines of the narcissistic pattern, whether experienced directly or through its impact on us, demands not merely initial insight, but a steadfast dedication to living in alignment with our deepest truths. We embark upon this phase of our exploration with the understanding that the ego, in its myriad manifestations, is remarkably resilient. Even after significant breakthroughs, moments of profound self-awareness, or the courageous setting of essential boundaries, the old patterns, the familiar gravitational pull of the false self, can reassert themselves with cunning subtlety. This demands from us a vigilant introspection, a continuous willingness to hold a mirror to our inner landscape and observe the nascent stirrings of entitlement, the subtle whispers of grandiosity, or the familiar anxieties of inadequacy. For the individual grappling with narcissistic tendencies, this means a lifelong commitment to self-observation, to questioning the impulse for external validation, and to consciously choosing vulnerability over defensive posturing. For those who have been impacted, it signifies an ongoing practice of self-worth affirmation, boundary reinforcement, and the gentle but firm release of the need to control or fix another's pathology. The path, therefore, is less a straight highway and more a winding labyrinth, replete with unexpected turns, moments of apparent regression, and hidden chambers requiring further illumination. We speak here of the arduous, yet ultimately liberating work of integrating the shadow. Pioneering analytical psychologist, notably Carl Jung, illuminated how the shadow encompasses those aspects of the self, the undesirable traits, weaknesses, and impulses that we deny, repress, or project onto others. For the narcissistic individual, the shadow often harbors the very insecurity, shame, and unworthiness that the grandiose facade strives so desperately to conceal. True healing necessitates a courageous descent into this internal underworld, to acknowledge and eventually embrace these disowned parts, not as flaws to be eradicated, but as integral components of the complete human experience. This integration is not about indulging destructive impulses, but about understanding their origins, disarming their power through conscious awareness, and rechanneling their underlying energy towards constructive ends. For instance, the drive for significance, often distorted into narcissistic grandiosity, can, when integrated, fuel genuine ambition and purposeful contribution. This profound internal work is rarely solitary. While the journey begins within, it finds its most potent crucible in the realm of authentic human relationships. Having previously explored how narcissistic patterns erode genuine connection, we now turn to how healthy relational dynamics become both a mirror and a catalyst for sustained growth. For the individual striving to overcome narcissistic tendencies, the willingness to truly see and hear another without an agenda for self-enhancement or control is revolutionary. This involves the painstaking practice of active listening, of validating another's experience without immediately centering one's own, and of offering genuine empathy even when disagreement persists. The discomfort that arises from receiving constructive feedback, from being seen in one's imperfection, or from admitting a mistake, becomes a vital opportunity for growth. It is in these moments of relational friction that the old ego defenses are most likely to flare, and it is precisely here that the conscious choice for humility and relational repair can forge new neural pathways and strengthen the nascent true self. For those who have navigated the treacherous waters of narcissistic abuse, the cultivation of healthy relationships is equally paramount, albeit focused differently. It involves discerning genuine reciprocity from transactional exchanges, trusting one's own intuition about safety, and slowly rebuilding the capacity for intimacy after profound betrayal. This process requires patience, self-compassion, and often the support of a therapeutic community or trusted allies who can offer consistent validation and model healthy attachment. We learn to set and maintain firm boundaries, not as acts of aggression, but as expressions of self-respect and necessary safeguards for our emotional and spiritual well-being. This ongoing relational work is the practical application of the insights gained, transforming abstract concepts of empathy and authenticity into lived experience. As we consistently engage in this internal and relational work, we are not merely dismantling the false self. We are actively cultivating and strengthening the authentic self. This involves a continuous connection to our intrinsic worth, a value that is not contingent upon external praise, achievement, or the approval of others. Spiritual practices such as mindfulness meditation, self-compassion exercises, and contemplative prayer become anchors, rooting us in the present moment and allowing us to access a deeper wellspring of inner peace and resilience. We begin to understand that true power lies not in dominance or control, but in vulnerability, in the capacity for genuine connection, and in the wisdom to accept life's inherent impermanence and imperfection. The true self is not a static achievement, but a continuous flow, a dynamic process of becoming perpetually refreshed by our conscious awareness and ethical choices. It is a self liberated from the exhausting performance, capable of genuine joy and profound sorrow, and deeply connected to the intricate web of existence. This continuous personal transformation inevitably has a ripple effect, extending beyond the individual to impact families, communities, and even the broader societal landscape. We cannot ignore that narcissistic patterns are not confined to individual psychopathology. They manifest as collective phenomena, shaping cultural narratives, political discourse, and economic structures. We see societal narcissism in the relentless pursuit of material gain at the expense of ecological balance, in the performative activism of social media, in political leaders who prioritize self-aggrandizement over public service, and in cultural trends that glorify superficiality and instant gratification. However, just as individual healing is possible, so too is the potential for a collective awakening. As more individuals commit to the arduous work of self-awareness, empathy, and integrity, they become agents of change within their spheres of influence. A parent who models vulnerability and genuine emotional expression helps break intergenerational cycles of narcissistic injury. A leader who embodies humility and prioritizes collective well-being over personal power inspires trust and collaboration. A community that fosters authentic dialogue and holds space for diverse perspectives builds resilience against divisive, ego-driven rhetoric. The conscious deconstruction of the false self in individuals contributes to the gradual dismantling of collective illusions and the fostering of a more compassionate, equitable, and sustainable world. We, the collective we, are invited to engage with cultural trends, social media platforms, and political processes not as passive consumers or easily manipulated audiences, but as discerning participants committed to truth, connection, and ethical responsibility. This means challenging narratives that promote division, prioritizing substance over spectacle, and advocating for systems that support the flourishing of all, rather than the aggrandizement of a few. The ultimate vision, then, is one of profound purpose and true liberation. This sustained journey, though demanding, culminates not in a perfect state of being, but in a rich and meaningful existence characterized by authentic presence, deep relational intimacy, and an expanded capacity for selfless contribution. It is a life where the energy previously consumed by defending a fragile ego is now channeled into creative expression, compassionate action, and the pursuit of a higher collective good. We are freed from the constant internal struggle, the exhausting need for external validation, and the spiritual isolation that defines the narcissistic condition. In its place, we discover a wellspring of intrinsic joy, a grounded sense of self-worth that is impervious to the whims of external circumstances, and a profound connection to something larger than ourselves. This liberation allows us to move beyond the narrow confines of self-interest into a space of universal compassion, recognizing our shared humanity and interconnectedness. It empowers us to forgive, not as an act of condoning harm, but as a release from the corrosive grip of resentment, thereby freeing our own spirits. It enables us to serve not from a place of seeking praise or control, but from an overflowing heart of genuine love and concern for the well-being of all beings. The journey itself, with all its challenges and triumphs, becomes the reward, a continuous process of awakening to our fullest potential, fostering genuine connection, and contributing to the gradual healing of ourselves and the world around us. We conclude this exploration not with a definitive answer, but with an enduring invitation to embrace the continuous unfolding path of self-discovery and transformation. It is a call to courageous introspection, to compassionate engagement with others, and to a steadfast commitment to cultivating a world where authenticity, empathy, and true connection prevail. The psychology of narcissism, when viewed through this integrated lens, ultimately reveals itself not merely as a pathology to be understood, but as a profound spiritual teaching, a mirror reflecting our collective human journey from fragmentation to wholeness, from illusion to liberation. The work continues within each of us and between us all. We have journeyed through the intricate landscape of narcissism, charting its psychological depths and spiritual dimensions, understanding its origins, manifestations, and profound impact. We have acknowledged the pervasive suffering it engenders, both for the individual ensnared within its gilded cage and for those caught in its destructive orbit. Yet, our inquiry would be incomplete, indeed insufficient, if we merely catalogue the pathology without illuminating the arduous, yet ultimately liberating pathways out of its confines. The enduring invitation to continuous self-discovery and transformation, which we posited as the ultimate aim, now beckons us to explore its practical architecture, the concrete steps and profound shifts required to dismantle the false self and cultivate authentic being. For the narcissistic individual, this journey commences with a monumental act of courage, the willingness to peer beyond the meticulously constructed facade and confront the fragile, often deeply wounded core that it conceals. This is not merely an intellectual exercise, it is an emotional descent into a terra incognita of shame, fear and inadequacy that has, perhaps for a lifetime, been meticulously avoided. Pioneering therapeutic approaches, particularly psychodynamic and schema-focused therapies, become indispensable guides in this initial phase. They provide a safe, consistent container within which the individual can begin to differentiate between the projected ideal self and the actual, vulnerable self. Through patient, empathic exploration, the origins of the narcissistic defenses are gently brought into awareness. The early relational failures, the unmet mirroring needs, the environments that demanded perfection and denied authentic expression. This process is akin to carefully excavating an ancient ruin, uncovering the foundational cracks that necessitated the elaborate, albeit ultimately unsustainable, edifice above. Crucially, the development of effective empathy emerges as a cornerstone of this transformative work. As we have observed, the narcissistic individual often possesses cognitive empathy, the ability to understand another's perspective intellectually, but struggles profoundly with the emotional resonance that allows for genuine connection. Cultivating effective empathy requires a conscious, sustained effort to attune to the internal states of others, to feel with them, rather than merely analyzing their reactions for personal gain. Mindfulness practices prove invaluable here, not only in fostering self-awareness, but also in training the individual to observe the subtle cues of others' emotions without immediate judgment or defensive reaction. Role-playing exercises, guided meditations focused on compassion, metta, and even careful facilitated discussions of personal impact can gradually build this capacity, like strengthening a muscle long atrophied. It is a painstaking process, often fraught with resistance, for truly feeling another's pain or joy requires a vulnerability that the false self has been engineered to suppress. Yet it is through this very opening that the possibility of authentic connection, and thus genuine self-worth, begins to emerge. Parallel to this, the rebuilding of an authentic self rooted in intrinsic worth, rather than external validation, becomes the central endeavor. This involves a profound reorientation of the internal compass. Where once the self-esteem was a volatile barometer fluctuating with external praise or criticism, it must now be anchored in an internal sense of value, competence, and integrity. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, offer practical tools for identifying and challenging the distorted thought patterns and maladaptive coping mechanisms that perpetuate the false self. The relentless pursuit of narcissistic supply gradually seeds to a more sustainable engagement with the world, driven by genuine interest, purpose, and a desire for contribution. This shift is often catalyzed by engaging in activities that foster a sense of mastery and meaning independent of external acclaim, creative pursuits, community service, or the cultivation of deep reciprocal friendships. It is in these spaces of authentic engagement that the individual begins to experience the quiet satisfaction of being, rather than perpetually performing. The gilded cage begins to dissolve as the individual discovers that their inherent worth is not contingent upon the adoration or subservience of others, but is an innate quality of their being. For those impacted by narcissistic relationships, the path to liberation is equally demanding, yet distinct in its focus. The initial and paramount step involves the unequivocal validations of their own experiences. After prolonged periods of gaslighting, invalidation, and emotional manipulation, the victim's internal compass is often severely compromised, their trust in their own perceptions eroded. Therapy, particularly trauma-informed approaches such as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing (EMDR), or somatic experiencing, provides a crucial framework for processing the deep emotional wounds inflicted. These modalities help individuals to safely revisit and metabolize the traumatic memories, releasing the physiological and psychological imprints of abuse. Support groups where shared experiences are affirmed and understood also play a vital role in dismantling the isolation and self-doubt that narcissism fosters. We encourage journaling as a powerful tool for self-revalidation, allowing individuals to document their feelings, observations, and insights, thereby reclaiming their narrative from the distorted versions imposed upon them. Establishing firm, unwavering boundaries is another critical component of healing for those impacted. This is not merely an intellectual exercise in setting limits. It is a profound act of self-reclamation, often requiring the courage to confront the fear of conflict, abandonment, or further devaluation. Boundaries, whether emotional, physical, or financial, are declarative statements of self-worth and self-respect. They define the permissible and the impermissible in interactions, creating a protective perimeter around the individual's energetic and emotional resources. Learning to articulate no clearly and consistently without guilt or lengthy explanation is a skill that must be painstakingly developed. This often involves navigating the predictable resistance and manipulative tactics of the narcissistic individual, who will invariably attempt to test or breach these newfound boundaries. Yet each successful enforcement reinforces the individual's sense of agency and strengthens their resolve, gradually rebuilding their capacity for self-protection. The restoration of self-esteem, so systematically undermined by narcissistic dynamics, is a journey of rediscovery and self-nurturing. It involves intentionally cultivating self-compassion, treating oneself with the same kindness and understanding one would offer a dear friend. Engaging in self-care practices, be it physical activity, creative expression, spending time in nature, or pursuing hobbies, becomes not a luxury but a necessity for replenishing depleted internal reserves. The focus shifts from seeking external approval to fostering an internal sense of peace and contentment. Building a robust support network of genuinely empathetic and reciprocal relationships is also paramount. These relationships act as corrective emotional experiences, demonstrating what healthy connection feels like and providing a safe space for vulnerability and authentic exchange, thereby counteracting the isolating effects of past abuse. Our integrated approach, which blends psychological therapies with spiritual practices, offers a holistic framework for these transformative processes. Psychological modalities provide the scientific rigor and structured interventions necessary to understand and modify behavior, process trauma, and develop healthier coping mechanisms. They address the ego's defenses and the mind's patterns. Spiritual practices, conversely, open pathways to deeper self-awareness, compassion, and a connection to something beyond the individual ego. Mindfulness, for instance, allows both the narcissistic individual and those impacted to observe their thoughts and emotions without identification, creating a crucial space for conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. It is the practice of simply being in the present moment, observing the rise and fall of sensations and emotions, that begins to dismantle the ego's relentless grip on past grievances or future anxieties. Compassion, a central tenet in many spiritual traditions, transcends mere sympathy. For the narcissistic individual, practicing compassion can begin with self-compassion, acknowledging their own pain and insecurity without self-judgment, understanding that their maladaptive patterns were often born of suffering. From this foundation, compassion can extend outwards, first to loved ones, then to those who have caused harm, and ultimately to all beings. For those impacted, self-compassion is vital for healing the wounds of invalidation and shame. It involves forgiving oneself for perceived failures, for staying too long, or for not seeing the truth sooner. It is a radical act of kindness that rebuilds the internal sanctuary. Service, or seva, offers another powerful spiritual antidote to egoic fixation. By shifting the focus from self-preoccupation to contributing to the well-being of others, individuals can experience a profound sense of purpose and interconnectedness. For the narcissistic individual, this can be a potent means of developing empathy and experiencing the intrinsic rewards of generosity. For those impacted, engaging in service can be empowering, transforming their experience of victimhood into one of agency and positive contribution, fostering a renewed sense of worth and efficacy. The integration of the shadow, a concept rooted in Jungian psychology, is an advanced but essential step on this journey. The shadow encompasses the unacknowledged, disowned aspects of the self, the flaws, weaknesses, and impulses that the ego deems unacceptable and thus projects onto others or represses. For the narcissistic individual, this often includes deep-seated insecurity, vulnerability, and a fear of insignificance. For those impacted, it might involve suppressed anger, a latent desire for control, or aspects of their own dark side that they have denied. Integrating the shadow involves a courageous confrontation and acceptance of these disowned parts, understanding that wholeness arises not from perfection, but from the conscious assimilation of all aspects of the self. This process diminishes the need for projection and allows for a more authentic, integrated self to emerge, capable of self-acceptance and genuine connection. Ultimately, the cultivation of authentic, reciprocal relationships stands as the highest aim and clearest indicator of profound transformation. These are relationships characterized by mutual respect, genuine empathy, vulnerability, and a balanced give and take. For the narcissistic individual on the path of healing, this means learning to truly see and value others as separate, sovereign beings, to engage in honest self-disclosure without fear of rejection, and to offer support and care without expectation of return. For those impacted, it means learning to discern healthy relational patterns, to trust their intuition, and to engage in relationships where their voice is heard, their feelings are validated, and their boundaries are honored. It is a challenging but deeply rewarding process of relearning how to connect, how to love, and how to be loved in ways that nourish the soul rather than deplete it. As individuals embark upon and sustain these transformative journeys, the ripple effect begins to manifest. Each act of courageous self-reflection, each boundary set, each moment of genuine empathy cultivated, contributes to a gradual shift in the collective consciousness. When individuals heal, they break intergenerational cycles of trauma and maladaptive patterns. They model healthy behavior for their families, communities, and wider society. The proliferation of authentic connection, born from the liberation of the false self, fosters a culture where empathy is valued, vulnerability is seen as strength, and intrinsic worth is universally acknowledged. This vision, while ambitious, is not utopian. It is the natural consequence of consistent, dedicated engagement with the profound work of self-discovery and transformation an ongoing invitation to build a more compassionate and truly connected world, one liberated heart at a time. We have journeyed through the intricate landscapes of narcissism, from its psychological roots in fractured selfhood to its spiritual echoes in the ego's tenacious grasp. We have traced its impact on individuals and relationships and explored the arduous yet profoundly rewarding pathways to healing and transformation. Now, as we stand at the precipice of understanding, we must delve deeper into the ultimate aspiration of this entire endeavor: the liberation from the false self, the awakening to the true self, and the subsequent cultivation of profound purpose, genuine connection, and boundless compassion, leading us toward a more empathetic and connected world. This awakening is not a mere intellectual understanding or a fleeting emotional experience. It is a fundamental shift in our mode of being, a reorientation from the superficial to the sublime, from the conditioned to the authentic. The true self, as many spiritual traditions and transpersonal psychologies attest, is not a construct of the ego, nor is it defined by our roles, achievements, or external validations. Instead, it is the intrinsic, unconditioned core of our being, a wellspring of peace, wisdom, and unconditional love that resides beneath the layers of personality, defense mechanisms, and societal conditioning. It is the part of us that remains whole, untouched by trauma or triumph, ever-present and luminous. To awaken to this true self is to shed the heavy armor of the false self, which, in its narcissistic manifestation, has been painstakingly constructed from fear, insecurity, and the desperate need for external affirmation. It is to recognize that our inherent worth is not contingent upon performance, praise, or power. This recognition frees us from the exhausting charade of perpetually proving our value, allowing us to rest in an unshakable sense of self-acceptance. When we operate from this place, the insatiable hunger for narcissistic supply dissipates, replaced by an inner abundance that does not demand from others, but rather offers itself freely. We no longer seek to fill an inner void with external accolades. Instead, we find ourselves whole and complete, a vessel overflowing with its own intrinsic light. The qualities that emanate from the true self are strikingly antithetical to the traits of narcissism. Where the false self is marked by grandiosity and entitlement, the true self expresses humility and gratitude. Where the false self is characterized by a pervasive lack of empathy, the true self embodies profound compassion and an innate understanding of interconnectedness. This is not a forced virtue, but a natural outpouring, a recognition that the suffering of another is, in essence, our own. When the boundaries of the ego dissolve, we perceive ourselves not as isolated entities competing for resources, but as integral threads in the vast tapestry of existence, each unique, yet fundamentally inseparable. Living from the true self, however, is not a destination but an ongoing practice, a continuous unfolding. The world, with its myriad pressures, temptations, and triggers, constantly invites us back into the familiar patterns of the ego. Old shadows may resurface, whispering doubts or tempting us with the allure of external validation. This journey demands vigilant introspection, a commitment to mindfulness, and a willingness to compassionately observe our inner landscape without judgment. It requires us to cultivate a robust inner compass, one that consistently points us back to our authentic core, even when the external winds threaten to blow us off course. Practices such as meditation, contemplative inquiry, and regular periods of solitude become not mere rituals, but vital anchors in this dynamic process, allowing us to regularly recalibrate and reconnect with our deeper essence. Moreover, the integration of the shadow, those unacknowledged aspects of ourselves that we have suppressed or disowned, becomes paramount in sustaining this liberation. The true self embraces all facets of our humanity, the light and the dark, the strengths and the vulnerabilities. It understands that true wholeness does not mean the eradication of imperfections, but rather their acceptance and integration into a richer, more nuanced sense of self. This holistic acceptance prevents the emergence of a new, subtler form of spiritual narcissism, where one might project an image of enlightened perfection while repressing any perceived flaws. Instead, it fosters genuine authenticity, allowing us to show up in the world with courage, transparency, and a profound sense of self-respect that does not require the approval of others. The ripple effect of this individual liberation extends far beyond the personal realm, serving as a powerful catalyst for a collective awakening and a profound challenge to societal narcissism. When individuals genuinely embody their true selves, their relationships transform. They move from transactional exchanges, where others are seen as sources of supply, to reciprocal partnerships built on mutual respect, deep listening, and genuine empathy. These authentic connections become micro-crucibles of transformation, radiating a new quality of interaction into their families, workplaces, and communities. Imagine a colleague who truly listens not to formulate their next brilliant interjection, but to understand, a family member whose conversations genuinely center on shared experience rather than constantly circling back to their own triumphs or grievances. These seemingly small shifts accumulate, gradually altering the very fabric of human interaction. Furthermore, individuals rooted in their true selves naturally resist, and in turn transform systems that perpetuate egoic values. Societal narcissism often manifests in our relentless pursuit of material wealth, superficial status, and ruthless competition, a collective mirroring of the individual's desperate chase for external validation. When we, as individuals, cease to derive our worth from these external markers, we begin to question and dismantle the societal narratives that champion them. We might, for instance, choose professions aligned with purpose over prestige, prioritize sustainable practices over endless consumption, or advocate for policies that foster equity and compassion over those that consolidate power and privilege. This shift is not necessarily confrontational, but rather an organic outflow of different values, a quiet but potent revolution of consciousness that challenges the prevailing egocentric paradigm. The cultivation of collective empathy and compassion then becomes a natural consequence. As more individuals connect with their true selves, the shared understanding of our fundamental interconnectedness deepens. We begin to perceive the inherent dignity and worth in every human being, regardless of their background, beliefs, or behaviors. This expanded empathy allows us to move beyond judgment and towards a more nuanced understanding of suffering, even in those who perpetuate harm. We recognize that aggressive or manipulative behaviors often stem from deep-seated wounds and unaddressed pain, echoing the very fragility we explored within the narcissistic individual. This does not excuse harmful actions, but it provides a framework for addressing them with wisdom, firmness, and a profound desire for healing rather than mere retribution. The vision of an empathetic and connected world, therefore, is not a utopian fantasy but a tangible possibility, born from the cumulative effect of individual awakenings. It is a world where collaboration supersedes competition, where intrinsic worth is valued above extrinsic achievement, and where mutual respect forms the bedrock of all interactions. In such a world, leaders would be guided by service rather than self-aggrandizement. Educational systems would foster emotional intelligence alongside intellectual prowess, and cultural narratives would celebrate authenticity, vulnerability, and interdependence. We would return to the ancient wisdom traditions that have always emphasized our place within a larger whole, recognizing our responsibility to each other and to the planet itself. This journey from the confines of the false self to the boundlessness of the true self is perhaps the most profound undertaking of human existence. It is an invitation to shed the illusions that bind us, to heal the wounds that separate us, and to reclaim the inherent wholeness that is our birthright. It is an ongoing process of becoming, of continually aligning ourselves with the deepest truths of our being. As we individually embark on this path, we contribute to a collective current of transformation, gradually reshaping the human experience and moving toward a world where genuine connection, purpose, and boundless compassion are not just ideals, but lived realities. The work is arduous, but the rewards, a liberated self and a more empathetic world, are immeasurable. We are, each of us, architects of this evolving consciousness, invited to participate in the grand unfolding of our shared humanity. We have journeyed through the intricate landscapes of the narcissistic psyche, tracing its psychological origins in early relational failures and its spiritual roots in the ego's tenacious grip. We have explored the profound impact on those caught in its orbit and illuminated the dual pathways to healing, one for the individual ensnared by narcissism, another for those bearing its wounds. Yet as we stand at this precipice of understanding, we must acknowledge that liberation is not a singular destination but an ongoing, fluid process, a continuous unfolding rather than a definitive arrival. The work, as we have seen, is arduous, demanding relentless courage and profound honesty, but it promises a liberation that extends far beyond individual solace, rippling outwards to touch the very fabric of our collective existence. The ego, in its infinite complexity and cunning, is remarkably resilient. It does not easily relinquish its hold even when confronted with the undeniable evidence of its self-imposed suffering. Indeed, one of the most subtle challenges on the path to genuine self-discovery is recognizing how the ego, in its desperate bid for survival, can appropriate the very language and practices of healing. We may observe individuals embarking on a spiritual path, only to find their efforts subtly hijacked by a persistent need for recognition, for being seen as enlightened or evolved. This phenomenon, often termed spiritual bypassing, illustrates the ego's sophisticated capacity to transform even the noblest intentions into another form of self-aggrandizement, using spiritual concepts to avoid genuine emotional processing or to maintain a sense of superiority. It is a potent reminder that the journey of self-awareness is not about eradicating the ego, but about understanding its mechanisms, integrating its shadow aspects, and preventing it from dictating our authentic being. Integrating the shadow, those disowned aspects of the self, our perceived flaws, vulnerabilities and imperfections, is not a one-time therapeutic revelation, but a painstaking, lifelong endeavor. The shadow does not simply disappear once acknowledged. It is an ever-present aspect of the human condition, requiring vigilant introspection and compassionate acceptance. For the individual grappling with narcissistic patterns, this means repeatedly facing the deep-seated shame, the gnawing insecurity, and the profound fear of inadequacy that lie beneath the grandiose facade. It involves tolerating the discomfort of not being perfect, of making mistakes, and of receiving criticism without collapsing into self-loathing or lashing out in defense. This requires a profound shift from an external locus of validation to an internal wellspring of self-worth, a shift that is often fraught with anxiety and the temptation to revert to old, familiar patterns of projection and blame. For those impacted by narcissism, Shadow integration might involve acknowledging their own tendencies towards codependency, their fear of abandonment, or their unconscious attraction to dynamics that mirror past wounds. It means recognizing that while they are victims of another's patterns, their own healing journey necessitates a courageous look at their internal landscape and their role in co-creating relational dynamics. Crucially, authentic human relationships serve as indispensable crucibles for this ongoing growth. After years, or even decades of relating through the distorted lens of narcissistic dynamics, whether as the perpetrator or the recipient of its impact, the very concept of genuine connection can feel alien, even terrifying. For the individual healing from narcissistic patterns, learning to engage in reciprocity, to truly listen without an agenda, to offer empathy without expectation of return, and to tolerate vulnerability without immediately erecting defenses is revolutionary. It requires dismantling deeply ingrained habits of control, manipulation, and self-serving interaction. It means risking rejection and navigating the messy, imperfect reality of human connection, where conflict is inevitable and compromise is essential. This is where the hard work of developing effective empathy, cultivated through practices of mindfulness and compassion, finds its most potent expression. It is in the mirror of another's eyes, reflecting back not an idealized image, but a nuanced, complex self, that true self-integration can begin to solidify. For those impacted by narcissism, forming authentic relationships after experiencing profound invalidation and emotional abuse demands an equally profound courage. Trust, once shattered, is rebuilt with painstaking slowness, brick by painful brick. The fear of vulnerability, of being exploited or dismissed again, can be paralyzing. Yet, it is within the safety of truly reciprocal relationships, characterized by mutual respect, clear boundaries, and genuine attunement, that the narcissistic wound can finally begin to heal. Here, one learns that their voice matters, their feelings are valid, and their inherent worth is not contingent on another's approval. These relationships provide the corrective emotional experiences necessary to rewire neural pathways that have been conditioned by trauma. They offer a space where one can practice being authentically seen and heard, where empathy flows both ways, and where the self, once diminished, can re-emerge whole and empowered. Such connections are not merely pleasant, they are vital for psychological and spiritual recovery, fostering the genuine connection that the false self, in its isolation, can never truly achieve. This individual transformation, arduous and deeply personal as it is, does not exist in a vacuum. It generates a powerful ripple effect, challenging societal narcissism and fostering a collective awakening towards a more empathetic, connected world. When individuals heal from the grip of narcissistic patterns, or from the trauma inflicted by them, they become agents of change. They cease to participate in or tolerate the very dynamics that perpetuate societal egocentrism. Consider the pervasive influence of social media, often a potent amplifier of narcissistic tendencies, rewarding superficial validation and performance over authentic connection. An individual who's cultivated intrinsic self-worth is less susceptible to the siren call of external likes and shares. They model a different way of engaging with technology, prioritizing genuine interaction and meaningful contribution. Furthermore, as more individuals cultivate self-awareness and compassion, they become better equipped to discern and resist narcissistic patterns in larger societal structures. We begin to question systems that prioritize profit over people, power over justice, and image over integrity. The grandiosity of certain political figures, The exploitative practices of some corporations, the shallow consumerism that promises happiness through external acquisition, these societal manifestations of collective narcissism become visible and intolerable. The healed individual, having confronted their own shadows, is less likely to project their unconscious needs onto charismatic leaders or ideological movements that demand unquestioning loyalty. They are better able to hold complexity, tolerate ambiguity, and engage in critical thinking rather than succumbing to simplistic narratives that flatter the collective ego. This collective awakening manifests not through a sudden dramatic revolution, but through an incremental shift in consciousness. It is seen in the growing emphasis on ethical leadership, on sustainable practices, on mental health awareness, and on the cultivation of empathy in education. It is reflected in movements that advocate for social justice, environmental stewardship, and genuine human connection across divides. In such a world, purpose is redefined beyond material accumulation to encompass contribution, creativity, and the flourishing of all beings. Intrinsic worth becomes the bedrock of identity, liberating individuals from the exhausting pursuit of external validation. And boundless compassion, no longer a mere spiritual ideal, transforms into a guiding principle for social policy, community building, and interpersonal interaction, recognizing the shared humanity and inherent dignity of every individual. The journey we have charted, from the intricate workings of the narcissistic individual to the potential for collective liberation, is an invitation. It is an invitation to continuous engagement in self-discovery and transformation, an ongoing commitment to peeling back the layers of the false self and embracing the authentic, compassionate core that resides within each of us. The work is indeed arduous, demanding courage to face uncomfortable truths, resilience to navigate setbacks, and unwavering dedication to the path of awareness. Yet the promise it holds, profound personal liberation from the confines of the ego and the potential for a more empathetic, connected world, is boundless. It is a testament to the enduring human capacity for growth, for healing, and for the unfolding of a consciousness rooted in intrinsic worth, boundless compassion, and genuine connection. Let us therefore continue this vital work, knowing that each step taken towards self-awareness contributes to the grand tapestry of a more conscious and compassionate humanity. We have journeyed through the intricate landscapes of the narcissistic self, from its fragile origins to its complex manifestations, and explored the profound impacts it casts upon both the individual and those within their relational sphere. We have also illuminated the integrated path toward healing and transformation, a courageous endeavor that beckons us beyond the confines of the false self towards the boundless expanse of authentic being. Yet, to speak of awakening as a singular event, a destination reached and then simply inhabited, would be to misrepresent the dynamic, ongoing nature of profound inner work. True liberation is not a static state, but a sustained resonance, a continuous attunement to the authentic self amidst the ceaseless currents of life. Consider, if you will, the initial experience of a profound insight or a moment of spiritual clarity. It can feel like a sudden shaft of light piercing through long-held shadows, revealing a truth so self-evident and liberating that it promises an immediate and permanent shift. Indeed, such moments are pivotal. They are the catalysts that reorient our internal compass. However, the ego, with its deeply ingrained patterns and its intricate architecture built over years, does not simply dissolve in the face of a single revelation. It is a persistent echo, a habituated response system that, even when weakened, retains a remarkable capacity for resurgence. This is why we speak of transformation as an ongoing process. demanding not just initial courage but sustained vigilance and unwavering commitment. The journey of integration, therefore, becomes a daily practice, a mindful navigation through the subtle ways in which the old self attempts to reassert its dominion. For the individual who has begun to dismantle the gilded cage of narcissism, this vigilance is paramount. We observe that the ingrained scripts of grandiosity, the subtle pull towards external validation, or the reflexive urge to control narratives do not vanish overnight. They may manifest as fleeting thoughts, as a momentary discomfort with vulnerability, or as an unconscious inclination to steer conversations back to oneself. The true measure of progress lies not in the complete absence of these echoes, but in the growing capacity to witness them without identification, to acknowledge their presence without succumbing to their pull. This is the essence of non-reactivity, a fundamental practice in mindfulness that allows us to observe our internal states, our desires, fears, and habitual responses with a compassionate detachment, thereby creating space for a conscious, self-authored response rather than a conditioned reaction. For those who've been impacted by narcissistic abuse, the sustained resonance of healing similarly demands continuous attention. The narcissistic wounds they carry are not superficial scratches, but deep fissures in the bedrock of self-esteem and trust. While therapy, boundary setting, and self-compassion lay the groundwork for repair, the subtle triggers and lingering echoes of past trauma can resurface, often unexpectedly. A seemingly innocuous comment, a familiar power dynamic, or even a moment of vulnerability in a new relationship can stir dormant fears of invalidation or abandonment. The work here involves not just processing past trauma, but actively repatterning the nervous system and the mind to respond from a place of intrinsic worth and secure attachment, rather than from the learned responses of fear and self-doubt. This requires consistent self-validation, the reinforcement of healthy boundaries, and the conscious cultivation of relationships built on reciprocity and genuine respect. We find that the true strength of resilience lies in this continuous active repair, transforming the narrative from one of victimhood to one of empowered self-authorship. Furthermore, the integration of the shadow self, those disowned, suppressed, or unacknowledged aspects of the self, is never a finite task. As we grow and evolve, new layers of the psyche may reveal themselves, aspects that were previously hidden or simply not yet ready to be confronted. The commitment to self-honesty, to embracing both our perceived light and our perceived darkness, is a lifelong undertaking. It is through this ongoing integration that we move beyond the simplistic dualities of good and bad, strong and weak, towards a more holistic and authentic understanding of our complex humanity. This process is crucial for preventing the emergence of new, subtle forms of egoic inflation or self-deception, which can sometimes masquerade as spiritual progress, if not rigorously examined. As individuals embark upon and sustain this profound inner work, the ripple effect we discussed earlier begins to manifest with tangible force. An awakened individual, one who is increasingly anchored in their true self, radiates a different quality of presence. Their interactions are characterized by genuine empathy, by an absence of the need to control or dominate, and by a profound respect for the inherent dignity of others. They become crucibles for authentic connection, fostering environments where honesty, vulnerability, and mutual support can flourish. This shift is subtle yet powerful, challenging the prevailing egoic patterns in their immediate spheres. When a family member, a colleague, or a friend consistently responds with compassion rather than defensiveness, with active listening rather than self-absorption, it creates a subtle disruption in the established narcissistic dynamics, inviting a different mode of interaction. This individual transformation, multiplied across communities, holds the potential to catalyze a broader collective awakening. We observe that societal narcissism, often fueled by the competitive individualism, consumerism, and the relentless pursuit of external markers of success, is fundamentally challenged by the presence of individuals who embody intrinsic worth and collective well-being. Imagine, if you will, a workplace where the primary drivers are collaboration and shared purpose rather than cutthroat competition and credit grabbing. A community where genuine support replaces superficial networking. A political landscape where integrity and service supersede self-aggrandizement and power plays. These are not utopian fantasies, but the natural outgrowths of a consciousness that has transcended the limitations of the ego. The development of effective empathy, in particular, becomes a cornerstone of this collective shift. Moving beyond cognitive empathy, the intellectual understanding of another's perspective, to affective empathy, the capacity to genuinely feel with another, is a profound leap. It is born from a deep connection to our own shared humanity, an understanding that beneath the myriad differences, we are all woven from the same fabric of longing, vulnerability, and potential. Practices such as loving-kindness meditation, compassionate inquiry, and active listening cultivate this capacity, allowing us to bridge the chasm of separateness that the ego so diligently constructs. When empathy becomes a pervasive force, the impulse to exploit, diminish, or disregard others begins to recede, replaced by an innate drive towards connection and mutual flourishing. Living in alignment with the true self means embodying humility, gratitude, and boundless compassion in our daily lives. Humility is not self-abasement, but an accurate understanding of our place within the vast tapestry of existence, recognizing our interdependence and the inherent worth of all beings. Gratitude is not merely a polite acknowledgement, but a profound appreciation for the gift of life and the countless blessings, large and small, that sustain us. And compassion, in its deepest sense, is not pity but a shared suffering, an active engagement with the pain of the world coupled with a commitment to alleviating it. These are the qualities that naturally arise when the ego's demands for superiority and control are relinquished. Of course, sustaining this alignment is not without its challenges. The external world, with its pressures, expectations, and often chaotic energies, can pull us back towards old patterns. The news cycle, social media, the demands of work, or even the complex dynamics of personal relationships can trigger the ego's defensive mechanisms. This is why the tightrope walk over the chasm metaphor remains acutely relevant. It requires continuous self-awareness, a consistent return to practices that ground us in the present moment, and a willingness to course correct when we stray. It demands courage to stand firm in our authenticity, even when it means deviating from societal norms or challenging established power structures. Yet, the profound rewards far outweigh the arduousness of the journey. The liberation from the false self is not merely the absence of suffering, but the presence of an abiding peace, a clarity of purpose, and an unshakable sense of intrinsic worth. It is the experience of living from a place of spaciousness and freedom, where the frantic striving of the ego is replaced by the effortless flow of being. This allows for genuine creativity, for authentic service, and for relationships that are deeply nourishing and reciprocal. The fear of judgment diminishes, the need for approval recedes, and the capacity for unconditional love expands exponentially. Ultimately, the individual journey towards an awakened self merges with the collective aspiration for a more empathetic and connected world. Each person who undertakes this transformation becomes a beacon, contributing to a global shift in consciousness. It is through these myriad individual acts of courage, self-reflection, and compassionate engagement that the fabric of society itself begins to reweave itself, thread by precious thread. The work is indeed continuous, a testament to humanity's boundless potential for profound growth and transformation, an unending invitation to shed the illusions of separateness and embrace the radiant truth of our interconnected existence. We are, in essence, called to participate actively in the ongoing evolution of consciousness, not as isolated entities, but as integral parts of a vast, unfolding spiritual tapestry, where every thread matters, and every awakening resonates with the whole. This is the profound promise and the ongoing challenge of living a truly conscious life.